Hey, good morning. It's Friday, January 31st. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 483 days old. I'm your host, Mark Montgomery, Senior Director of FDD Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, filling in for Jon Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is my good friend, retired U.S. Air Force General Mike Minihan. Over the course of his decades-long career, he's held numerous Joint Air Force command positions, culminating in his tour as commander of U.S. Air Force's Air Mobility Command, all the military lift and refueling assets in the nation. In other words, he's got the resume. I'm excited to speak to him shortly about his career and about his experiences moving weapons and support to Israel in the wake of October 7th and more. So please stay tuned for that. Look, being prepared to fight your adversary and win is the ultimate task for any military commander. I knew that as a Navy officer. Many knew it as an Air Force officer. This requires not only the right tools and plans, but also the right people, all properly trained and organized to face the enemy head on. If your adversary sees that you are prepared and willing to fight, you may be lucky enough to deter them from acting. But any sign of real or perceived weakness can have the polar opposite effect. On October 7th, Israel had the manpower and the tools to confront Hamas as they stormed over the border, but they lacked the preparedness. The element of surprise came at a heavy cost, and securing southern Israel is a grueling challenge to this day. When Israel took the fight to Hezbollah in Lebanon in September 2024, it was quite the opposite. It was evident that all three elements of military preparedness, tools, plans, and people, were aligned, leading to a comprehensive victory. Israeli actions against the regime in Iran have been similarly effective. The United States military must be equally ready in any future fight with China, equipped with the necessary tools, plans, and personnel to confront Beijing head-on. General Minihan, who I'll be speaking with shortly, was one of the few senior U.S. officers willing to publicly emphasize this necessity. His calls for readiness to confront Chinese aggression were not well received by senior leadership in the Department of Defense, and he was ushered into retirement, probably one job earlier than he should have been. Yet I would argue that his directness, his bold leadership are exactly what the U.S. military needs and expects from its senior officers. It will be a treat to speak with him later on. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani arrived in Syria yesterday. At Damascus International Airport, Syria's interim prime minister, foreign minister, and defense minister joined the interim Syrian president, Ahmad al-Shara, previously known as Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, in welcoming Al Thani and the rest of the Qatari delegation. The Qatari emir thanked al-Shara for his warm welcome. The Qatari leader spoke with his Syrian counterpart about the need to form a government in Damascus that represents the Syrian people. According to the Qatari press, the emir left his meeting with al-Shara optimistic about the future of Syria and Syrian-Qatari relations. Al-Thani is the first head of state to visit Syria since the autocrat Bashar al-Assad's ouster in early December. That's hardly surprising, as my colleague Jon Schanzer has pointed out repeatedly here before. Qatar is a patron of Syria's new Islamist leaders. Plain and simple, and I like to say this is the Qataris, a nasty piece of work. Headline 2, the Israeli Defense Forces shot down a Hezbollah surveillance drone. No siren sounded, and the Israeli Air Force intercepted the drone before it crossed into Israeli territory. Why is this significant? Because it was reportedly the first episode with a Hezbollah drone since the ceasefire took hold in Lebanon back in November. But we should make no mistake, Hezbollah has not been sitting tight and quiet for the past 2 months. Earlier this week, the IDF struck a Hezbollah weapons convoy traversing across southern Lebanon in violation of the ceasefire agreement. Hezbollah operatives were also among the hundreds of Lebanese individuals who attempted to flood villages in southern Lebanon, engaged in what the IDF calls as provocations. All right, headline 3, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Mustafa has weighed in on the future of Gaza. In remarks to Bloomberg News, Mustafa said that the PA plans to rebuild Gaza with the help of the United States and Saudi Arabia. Well, I hope that's mostly Saudi Arabia. The ultimate goal, he said, is to create a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank run by the Palestinian Authority. He expects Hamas to exist as a cultural and political entity, just stripped of its military capabilities and governing authority. Good luck. Here's the thing. The Israeli government doesn't want the PA, as it stands today, to govern post-war Gaza. The PA is rampant with corruption and continues to reward terrorism with a policy colloquially known as pay to slay. Mustafa told Bloomberg that he started a program to address corruption and inefficiency in the Palestinian Authority. And the jury is definitely still out as to whether any meaningful change will happen. But let's try to end on an optimistic note. Mustafa said he believes that the Trump administration could push a Middle East deal across the finish line that solves the Palestinian issue and sees Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel. Now, that would be something. All right. Now for the interview with retired U.S. Air Force General Mike Minihan. His call sign's Mini. He's 6'4". You can figure it out. I'm excited to welcome onto the program. All right, welcome to the program, Mini.
Hey, good morning, sir. Great to see you, and honored to be on this podcast with you. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. So I already said it. You commanded the Air Force's Air Mobility Command, and you commanded it for nearly a year after the October 7th attacks. Many people may not realize the role AMC played in Israel's ability to fight in Gaza. What were these operations like for the U.S. Air Force?
Yeah, well, it's important first to just set the foundation here. Air Mobility Command, 110,000 people, 1,000 airplanes. It's the largest flying operation in the world. Most diverse with what we do, but also the most diverse in the mission sets that we accomplish. So you nailed it in your intro. We do the big lift, the airlift, we do the aerial refueling, we do the air medical evacuation, and we do all the things on the ground to enable those things in the air. So pretty big. It's also a total force. So not just active duty, but the Guard and Reserve are essential components of this capability. All of that was put into play for the response to Israel. It's important to note that I came in command right after the Kabul evacuation. It's also important to note that that was also after our response to support Ukraine with the Russian invasion there. So two pretty big data sets that led into our Israel response. It's also important to note that prior to Israel was also a big exercise we did in the Pacific called Mobility Guardian. So all these things, enormous data sets, enormous opportunities to understand where our challenges were and then also improve. So we literally exploded into theater when called for the Israel response. We did every aspect of our mission set. We hauled enormous capabilities into Iraq, into Saudi, into the Gulf states so that we could protect Americans and our partners and allies. We did enormous support directly into Israel. We utilized air refueling to make all of that happen. And then it's also important to note that we did all the things for the consequent management for what we didn't know yet. So think about evacuation of civilians. Think about humanitarian operations. Think about air medical evacuation should the war spread beyond the confines of that area. So all of that, the way I describe it was as big a push for about 60 days as the initial Desert Storm. Enormous amount of capabilities had to be taken out of the continental United States and pushed into theater as quickly as possible. I'm incredibly proud of the team that executed. They took all their lessons learned from those series of operational exercises that we did in advance, and then they truly got the capability downrange for the soldier, sailor, airmen, Marines, Guardians, and also our partners and allies that needed it quick. So really big lift. And then to get off the stage comment on this is the command and control to make that happen. The command and control to nest with our joint partners here, in the U.S., but also the command and control to nest with our partners and allies in theater was exquisite.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad you put it in context that while you were supporting Israel with multiple flights per day initially, and then daily after that, you're still supporting the movement of weapons to Ukraine, the movement of forces around the Pacific, just the movement, the support to our forces that were stationed in Arab countries. I mean, this is the Air Mobility Command is just a constant Borg of process. I'm surprised now that you've retired, you haven't been called by Delta or United to take over as CEO.
Well, I describe ourselves, and I've yet to be challenged on this. Maybe your audience will do it. Air Mobility Command is the most relied upon force in the history of warfare. And I don't say that from a position of arrogance, nor do I say it from one seeking sympathy. But it's a comment on everybody relies on Air Mobility Command to do their jobs. And it's also a comment on what's at stake if we don't do our jobs. You know, there's partners and allies that are left hanging. There's critical missions that the U.S. can't do. At the same time, we're also the most vulnerable, the least connected, the least integrated. So, you know, there's an enormous amount of investment, in my opinion, that has to go into the mobility forces. But that gap that exists now is filled by the professionalism and the courage of the team that's out there executing.
Well, speaking of professionalism and courage, you led AMC following the chaotic 2021 departure from Afghanistan that you mentioned earlier. Many of us can't get rid of the visual of a desperate Afghans, you know, falling out of wheel wells as the C-17s took off. What was that operation like for Air Mobility Command?
Yeah. Well, it's important when I answer this question that I'm separate my answer from why it happened. You know, I'm as frustrated as anybody. If you know, for people like you and I that dedicated almost our entire adult lives to that conflict, and then to have it in that way, you know, incredibly disappointing and frustrating. Now, to answer the question, I'm going to talk about, you know, the response by the joint team that went in there and, you know, evacuated that number of people in that short a time under those constraints, you know, is a monumental effort. So, you know, you're correct. I did not command Air Mobility Command during that time. I came in about a month and a half later, and I helped conduct the after action reports to make sure that we were gleaning the right lessons and that we did not, you know, that we did not take the opportunity to improve. So, you know, an enormous amount of agility was needed. And you know this, you know, I learned this from you. You know, the entry into crisis is very delicate, and it's hard to distinguish when you're in normal and maybe there's some unrelated data points from when there's a trend leading to this. So I think that the trend into crisis was pretty quick here. It was everything from taking aircraft that were already in the system and flowing them into the AOR area of responsibility, from, you know, units that were at home doing training missions that quickly got re-rolled into the into the response for the Kabul evacuation. Just like with Israel, every asset, you know, in our mission portfolio was put into play. So the airlift, the aerial refueling, the air medical evacuation, all the stuff on the ground went in. Those went in theater, and it was extremely turbulent, extremely confusing. We suffered because of the lack of connectivity and the lack of our ability to command and control, hampered operation efficiency. I wouldn't say that it chipped away at effectiveness, but we put our airmen in a position where they had to really overcome some incredible challenges that shouldn't have been there. So I resolved during my tenure to hammer those out: connectivity, command and control, tempo, fundamentals, all those things that are so critical to precise military operations, to executing the projection of power, to supporting the joint team, to integrating with partners and allies, needed to be improved. And as challenging as Kabul evacuation was, it pales in comparison to what will happen in the Pacific. So there's an enormous imperative here that I've dedicated my whole time in Air Mobility Command to, and intend to dedicate my post-military career to as well.
Okay, let me get to that. I do want to remind people, though, that as much as there was a desperate picture of young men falling out of Afghan men falling out of wheel wells, there's a wonderful photo of Afghan families inside a C-17 belly that must have been approaching 600, you know, double or triple the number of allowable passengers on board a flight, and the pilot still got off the ground and got those people to safety.
Incredible what they did as crew members. And I say crew, bigger than the mobility team, but, you know, as a joint team, really demonstrated the best qualities, you know, I think, of American warriorship. You know, resilient, agile, and, you know, those out there executing on the pointy end, just incredible in their ability to get the mission done. And at the same time, as you just described, have the compassion to handle, you know, the American and the internationals on that flight, and you know, and overcome incredible challenges, still provide that, you know, what only America can do, provide that hope over great distances.
Thanks. You know, definitely we were executing branch plan cluster F at that point. So well done. Hey, look, you mentioned it here, but also you've publicly voiced your concerns while on active duty with the kind of the readiness, the modernization, the capacity of the nation's military lift forces. As I mentioned, probably in a way that pissed your bosses off. What do we need to do to make sure we could fight and win that big war with China and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things off. First of all, the data set. Just to review the data set again. After action from the Kabul evacuation, straight into Ukraine, straight into Israel, straight into humanitarian operations in Gaza. The big exercise in the Pacific. So my data set's pretty wide on these conclusions, but it generally all boils down to connectivity, which is what you need to talk. Command and control, which is what you do with connectivity. Tempo required to win. Can we maneuver at the tempo required to win? And then do we have the fundamentals to actually back up what we say we can do? And I think we got enormous challenges in the mobility fleet. The mobility fleet is the most relied upon fleet in the history of warfare. It's also the most vulnerable, the least connected, and the least integrated. We have got to get into planning rooms, and we have got to play mobility and all of the variables that come with logistics for real. Munitions, fuel, every class of supply. We've got to integrate joint silos that exist now so that the team can go out there and function as one. And you know this better than I, but it's not about the plan that comes out of planning. It's about the planning. It's about the relationships that are formed early. It's about tackling the tough challenges together. And it's about commanders, operational commanders out in the field, understanding exactly where their opportunities and risk lie. I'm 3 years of a pretty extreme frustration trying to get after the plan, everybody in the right room. Let's eliminate all the caveats. Let's expose all the risks, and let's ensure that the mobility team can provide the maneuver that the joint team needs to win. I mean, be incredibly lethal, so lethal that it's unfair. That's what we're driving for.
That's a good goal. I want to translate Air Force to English and say, when Mini says I've got the data sets, what he's saying is I got the facts. This is how it is. And at the end, when he was talking about all the different things, what he's really saying is I need the resources. And this is a problem. It happens in all the services. Shiny objects get money. F-22s, F-35s, fighter jets get money in the Air Force. The things that make shiny objects successful, like refueling, lift to get weapons places, that gets second-tier funding. And if you do that long enough, your shiny objects suck.
Yep.
Hey, you're looking to continue your commitment to serve the Air Force even in retirement, spending your time running a policy center that advocates for Air Force mobility. Tell me a little bit about that.
So it's a great segue from your last comment prior to that, which is, the mobility fleet is approaching 4 generations behind the fighters and bombers that we're supposed to support. So it's incredibly handicapped. You have more connectivity on your cell phone right now and in your car than my mobility fleet had in its cockpits and in the ground elements that support the flight. So that's inexcusable. We're operating the second tanker that this nation ever built. It's a wonderful airplane. It's going to be the foundation of America's tank force for another 2 decades. But imagine if your Navy was still operating the second frigate, or if the fighters were still operating the second fight. If you don't like that analogy because it's too extreme, then imagine if your Navy was still operating the frigates from the late 50s and the early 60s. This is a gross deficit intentionally burdened on the mobility tribe. So I'm going to dedicate, a continued provocative thought forward. I've authored a pamphlet called Mobility Manifesto, and then Beyond the Manifesto, that gets after these type of things and what we need to do to put the appropriate investment intellectually and resource-wise into the mobility fleet. I don't think that the elements that support the Air Force do a good job highlighting the mobility fleet as something that needs attention. So I intend to fill that gap. So think tank, either titled Mobility Manifesto or Subtle AF. I don't know what it's going to be, but the intention is to keep tension provocatively, thoughtfully, passionately on what the mobility fleet needs to enable everybody else's success.
I look forward to seeing it, and I'll talk about it in further FDD events, because I think This is the kind of thing, this is the part of the U.S. military that supports our allies and partners overseas with weapons deliveries, with fueling, with support during exercises. So something we should really be pushing for here. Easy last question.
Okay, bring it.
All right. Who's the best boss you ever worked for?
All right. Hey, listen, my time with you was incredible. You and Admiral Harris, great bosses. The challenges that we, handled, the provocative North Korean missile launches, China and the contested features, my first dip into really in-depth joint operations. I worked for this magnificent 2-star Navy admiral that was fiery and smart and demanding and hard to work for in a good way. And so the trophy will be in the mail. It'll be behind your in your next podcast on the mantle.
All right, well, obviously, that was the wrong answer. The right answer was Ashley. But your great spouse, and Lucinda joins me in saying
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Hey, thank you, General Mini, and for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Yep. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My CCTI colleague, Annie Fixler, and our great intern, Miriam Davlashedzi, co-authored a piece in the Cipher Brief on the growing importance of space-based systems for industries such as electricity, water, and finance, and of course the military. They criticized the Biden administration for failing to recognize space as a critical infrastructure and its vulnerability to cyber attacks from our adversaries, and underscored that President Trump now has a chance to reverse this error. My good friend Matt Pottinger, also chair of FDD's China program, wrote a piece in the Free Press underscoring President Trump's recent demonstrations of U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere. He stresses that while reasserting U.S. influence in his own neighborhood is important, it should not come at the expense of maintaining strength in the Middle East, in Europe, and crucially for our strategic competition with China, influence in Asia. Finally, in The Hill, FDD's Max Meslish and Rich Goldberg critiqued the Biden administration's approval of Ibrahim Rasool as South Africa's ambassador to Washington. They highlight Rasool's anti-Semitism and pro-Hamas views, along with his ties to the African National Congress, which openly celebrates Hamas terrorists. They urge Trump to remove Rasool from his post for the sake of America and for South Africans who oppose the government's growing ties with terrorists and dictators. Look, that's a wrap. If you're hungry for more analysis on a variety of topics related to foreign policy and national security, just check out our website, fdd.org. Make sure to also read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels. Who knew? We all got YouTube channels. And consider making a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Another guest host, FDD Senior Fellow and former IDF International Spokesman, and also a good friend, Jonathan Conricus, will be filling in for Jon Schanzer. His guest will be Somali-born British journalist and writer Rajay Omar. Be sure to check out that episode. Thanks for letting me host you today. I'm Mark Montgomery, signing off for FDD.